Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time for another custom card review. This time around, the theme was raid bosses from World of Warcraft's history, so we have some very cool cards to take a look at. That said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Up first here, we have Hakkar the Soulflayer from Imaginary MDA. And I wanted to put this card first because Hakkar is a character I think we're going to see in Rastakhan's Rumble. Now, it will not be a Warlock card because we already know the Warlock legendary Loa. So it wouldn't look exactly like this, but nonetheless, maybe something about this idea could still be captured in Rastakhan's Rumble. So for this version of Hakkar, it's a 9-mana 8/3 Warlock legendary, and I really like how this battle cry captures something Hakkar was known for and famous for in World of Warcraft. The battle cry reads, give all minions Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to your hero wherever they are. So as soon as you play this Hakkar the Soulflayer, basically every minion in hand, on board, and in deck suddenly has this just default death rattle added to it, where when it dies, it deals the damage to the hero who controls it. So essentially, you know, if your opponent is running a really minion-based deck and they still have 15, 20 minions around by the time you play Hakkar, if they play the game out to fatigue, essentially they would take 15 or 20 extra damage from this card. And I'll admit, I don't really think this is the strongest competitive card necessarily. Like, I don't think this would be played in a high tier deck or anything because it's rather slow at 9 mana. Doesn't have a great stat line at 8/3. I think it takes forever for this death rattle to really add up to a ton of value, which isn't often good in control decks. Also, if you're playing in a more fatigue style game plan, your opponent may not have that many minions. If they're still hanging around in the late game, they might have a lot more spells. So the total return on your investment with Hakkar probably isn't worth 9 mana. And first off, that's okay. Not every card featured in these videos, or certainly not every card in Hearthstone, is the most competitive card. Some of them are just more fun or thematic or establish a fantasy or, you know, play on some cool, neat idea. This one to me is that and less so a competitive card. Now, that said, all that teasing aside, the effect in World of Warcraft that this card captures is essentially in the Hakkar fight in Zul'Gurub way back in vanilla World of Warcraft. He would apply this like ticking dot to your character called Corrupted Blood. I think that's the name, some variation thereof. And it would pass from one player to another. So eventually everybody would have this corruption where they were just taking this dot, this damage over time. And in fact, if you timed it correctly, you could go back to major cities. Like you could Hearthstone out to a major city or maybe take a teleport. I don't remember the exact details. And you could spread this corruption to players inside a city. So you could just spread it throughout the city and kill off all kinds of low-level players because they couldn't stay alive to the ticking damage, of course, because they weren't max level. And it was this unbelievably cool event where you could just kill mass hordes of individuals in a capital city, you know, level 5 people just dying to this Corrupted Blood event. And it became a bit famous, and I think this version of Hakkar does a fairly good job of capturing that. Now, it's admittedly not a chaining effect. There were a couple people who did try to design Hakkar like that, and I just didn't think it felt like a Hearthstone style thing, or maybe it wasn't didn't work in my vision. So this one is a good middle ground where I think this could be achievable in the game. It still captures that where everything has this dot essentially, or this damage that's spreading back to your hero as opposed to spreading amongst minions. So to me, I thought this is a pretty cool execution of Hakkar. Obviously great artwork and all the name and stuff is there too. And at least a take on an idea that I would love to see in Hearthstone, and maybe in fact we will see in Hearthstone and Rastakhan's Rumble. Up next here, we have Kil'jaeden, and another Warlock legendary here, this time around from Red Stake, and it won't be the last time you see Kil'jaeden on this list. But for Red Stake's version, this is a 5-mana 5/5, and the battle cry reads, for the rest of the game, all minions are demons, wherever they are, and in fact, it even persists after death as well. So this just makes everything, all the cards, all the minions at least, are demons. And for Warlock, that presents some really intriguing applications. Suddenly, cards like Possessed Lackey that summon a demon from your deck, those become a lot more exciting because it's not just big Void Lords, for instance, that you could turn into cool demons. It's maybe the Lich King is suddenly a demon, and that's kind of cool because you could get some Lich Kings sneaking into play or just add a lot of consistency or redundancy to your possessed lackeys, for instance. And in fact, Kil'jaeden comes down on turn 5, so it's almost like perfectly on curve and decent stats here for Kil'jaeden as well. There are obviously other applications beyond just Possessed Lackey. A lot of demon synergy cards in Warlock between buffing them. You can even use things like Sacrificial Pact on any given minion in your deck. But maybe even more exciting, keep in mind, is that this isn't just friendly minions. It's also enemy minions. All minions are demons. And I'm going to go ahead and take a leap here and assume that also means they are not their normal tribe if they become demons. So if your opponent has a beast synergy deck, no longer can they take advantage of their beasts. They're demons instead, and you can Sacrificial Pact their enemy minions instead of them getting some cool kill commands and Houndmaster activations off. So there's this really neat way to counter, tribal or racial synergy decks by denying them that synergy, but also perhaps building in your deck in a way that enables you to take advantage of that. So whether that's just Sacrificial Pact for incredibly cheap removal on anything that your opponent plays, or building in some more active strategies on your own where you're trying to accomplish some game plan. There are a couple different ways. Skull of the Minari obviously is a card that would suddenly be really, really cool with a deck like this, just pulling every minion you have from your hand. So I like the way this changes the game in a really big way, and it's impactful. But by chance, if Kil'jaeden is hiding at the bottom of your deck, if you go too hard into this path, it could fail, it could backfire. Maybe your deck doesn't work as well as you thought it would. But those opportunities to disrupt your opponent, create neat opportunities for a synergy that wouldn't otherwise exist with all these different demon cards in Warlock, to me that's really fun. And it also fits what Kil'jaeden is all about, which is deception. Doing things in a sneaky or tricky kind of way. Turning everybody into demons is a pretty cool thing to do for being sneaky and tricky and kind of cheating a little bit. So a good fit for the character, good fit for Warlock, obviously, and a card with a really neat mechanic as far as I'm concerned. I promise I didn't mean to do this, but this is actually a third straight Warlock legendary minion. That was not the plan. I swear. I just put these cards in an order I thought looked good. We just happened to get 3 straight Warlock cards. But this is Magtheridon from Faerun, a 6-mana, 6/7 demon this time around. The Battlecry Magtheridon reads, randomly reassign all death rattles on the board, and Magtheridon has a death rattle that reads none. So essentially, no death rattle on this guy, but he, when you play him, swaps all the death rattles on the board. So he's basically taking his inactive death rattle and giving it to a card that otherwise had a death rattle. So in essence, this gives you a way to punish any cool, awesome death rattles your opponent has, or counter them and then gain them for yourself. So it makes death rattles a really risky thing to play against Magtheridon, for instance. So, they could have a Sylvanas out on the board. You would give their Sylvanas no death rattle, and you would give this card an incredibly cool death rattle, like Sylvanas's, for instance, or whatever random death rattle card you want to choose. Now, obviously, if there are multiple minions out there with death rattles, it's not going to be consistent. So it's not something you can do really well against, a deck that has a ton of death rattles. This probably isn't going to make as big of an impact because it's just one card. But for that single instance, it's almost, that it's not really a silence, it's not really a removal card, but it's a tech answer to death rattles. It does it in a unique way that if your opponent's not careful, if they play into it too hard, you get some insane extra value that would otherwise be impossible. And you can probably run through a lot of examples of cards that have very, very powerful death rattles and see how Magtheridon would work really nicely against those. I mean, Hadronox, I guess, is the most, sort of the highest example of death rattle that would be really, really punishing to take from your opponent. Beyond that, Magtheridon itself has really good stats as a Boulder Fist Ogre by default, so a card that doesn't feel bad to play out on curve or into a board. And for that reason, I think it does a really cool thing. It's a attack or a counter in a direction we haven't really seen in the past. It's different or better than a silence. Better than single target removal, and unique in its own super cool way. So for me, Magtheridon, I think it would be a welcome card for Warlock and a pretty neat design to see overall. Up next here, we have Fel Mist for Hunter. And this card comes from Wisdom Bison. And I like this one because it takes hunters back into the world of dragons like we saw with Imerys. This time around, it would be an 8 mana 10/10 dragon. The battle cry would read, deal 1 damage to all minions, and if any survive, give them poisonous. So this is a mechanic we've seen in a couple different ways in Hunter so far, the sort of poisonous element. Carrion Drake, Toxmonger. There are a couple cards that have started to toy around with this. Some of them have been Dragon Synergy cards as well with the Drake. So Felmyst seems like it might bundle that whole package together in a really cool way. And also it's just a giant dragon, which is super cool looking. And I like the design of this card because it is symmetrical. It's, you know, all minions on the board, so you can accidentally give your opponent poisonous minions, which might line up really, really well, for instance, at killing your 10/10, so that's a tad risky. But if you have a couple things on board that will survive this 1 damage AoE, and you give them poisonous, then this could be a great removal tool. You can't combo it with things like Unleash the Hounds for some crazy combo full board clear, but there are still some select ways to use it in intriguing ways to either flip the board or just, you know, sometimes a 1 damage AoE might be enough. That big Dread Infernal basically could be okay depending on the board state, and gives Hunter another way to interact in the late game, play big stuff, flip the board, while still utilizing a minion-based strategy, which I think Hunter is a class that wants to do that. To me, that makes it a great fit for the class, a fun take on the raid boss itself, and you know, combines essentially a couple different archetypes here that Hunter has been barely exploring in a fun new way. All around an awesome card that's great for the class. Moving on here, we have Baleroc the Gatekeeper, a 6 mana 4/7 minion from the Firelands raid, I guess it is. And this was made by Fwifo Force. Baleroc's got Taunt by default, so reasonable 4/7 body here for 6 mana with Taunt. Also has a battle cry that reads, summon 2 Shards of Torment for your opponent. And I really like this because that's straight from the raid fight. He summons these shards, essentially. And I also like this because I've also toyed around with this idea of giving bad things to your opponent and exploring that space. So the Shards of Torment would be a 3 mana 0/5. Remember, the opponent gets 2 of them, and they read, at the end of your turn, deal 2 damage to another friendly character. So these shards are a bit like Lightwell for Priest, but instead of healing, they're damaging random things. And that means that they're going to be targets that your opponent very much wants to remove from the board, because eventually they're just going to chip away all their minions and their own hero health, so on and so forth. And not all classes are clearly going to have a way to remove them. They're not going to be able to like buff them, for instance, with Inner Fire, unless they're Priest, and trade them in. They're going to linger. And that's scary and that's intimidating. It might force them to make some awkward plays if they feel like the shards are problematic. Or they might just be stuck with them for a long time. That means Baleroc is going to eventually add up to a lot of long-term value, which is good because a 6 mana 4/7 taunt's okay, but it's not like a game-winning sort of play. A little better than Rin, perhaps, for its raw body, but ultimately not a great thing unless the shards work. So you need the shards to work. And on that note, the shards eventually, presumably, will kill themselves, because think if your opponent doesn't really play anything at all, there's a good chance each shard's going to hit the other shard. So it's not like they're going to be there forever. They're not this just inescapable pain to deal with. They're going to eventually die off as long as you play the game right or don't play too many small minions. Even then, eventually they would die off. So it doesn't feel like it's crazy broken to me. Like it's not this just unavoidable damage for all time. They're going to chip each other down. You can eventually do a little work if you have to, force your hand, kill them. There's buff cards out there like Fungalmancer that frankly might make these scary to play. Like you don't want to give your opponent 2 0/5s that they turn into 2 giant 2/7 minions, even if those do a little bit of damage. That's just a big board presence, extra bodies to work with. So there are some downsides in certain matchups, upsides in other, but a fun design that very much fits the character from World of Warcraft, but also I think would just be a neat thing to have in Hearthstone, exploring that space where, okay, he gave me bad things. How do I work with these? How does my deck build around these? How do I avoid these? And to me, I think that's something we need to see in the game, adds an extra layer of depth, and it's different than something like Marin the Fox, for instance, because there's an active downside to that thing lingering out on board. So all said, pretty neat card. Up next, we have Latian the Thunder King, a 7 mana 5/8 Shaman legendary by Wawa. And this one has a death rattle that reads, deal damage to all enemies equal to the amount of mana crystals you've overloaded this game. So yes, that's right. If you've overloaded 10 mana crystals When Latian dies, it's going to deal 10 damage to the board and 10 damage to the enemy hero. If you get to 20, somehow, yes, it would overload 20 or deal 20 damage to the opposing hero and the opposing enemy board. So clearly the potential for something like Latian is fantastic. If you are able to successfully overload lots of mana throughout the course of the game, this guy is going to provide a lot of swing and maybe lethal when his death rattle activates. And a lot of people might be thinking, oh, that sounds really good, Regis. But keep in mind, first off, mana crystals are not always easy to overload in Hearthstone, and as an archetype, Overload Shaman has barely touched the fringe of playability. We've never seen a really prominent Overload Shaman deck. Yes, there were some aggro Shaman builds way back in the day with Tonal Shrug that had a lot of Overload, but they weren't really designed to synergize with Overload necessarily. They were more about raw aggression, and a 7 mana 5/8 is not really the finisher piece you're looking for in a deck like that. And the reason for that is because this is a death rattle. It's not a battle cry, which means you're playing this out there and sort of just kind of leaving it and hoping that it works. So it's susceptible to silences and polymorph effects, like many good minions are, but in this case would become an obvious target if you're able to overload a lot successfully. That's an issue. The other problem is it's not good in aggro decks because you just need a lot of overload to make it very powerful, which means it's going to happen naturally later in the game. It's already a 7 mana card. If you're overloading a lot, this might be something you don't play until turn 12, turn 15 for it to really be huge and impactful. Obviously, if you did overload the first few turns, you could still get this out on turn 7 for, 6, 9 overload probably without a huge difficulty. But again, a slow passive card that is not actually that easy to kill if you're the shaman yourself. Like, it doesn't trade that well into boards. If it trades into a 5/5, it's not dying, so the death rattle might be difficult to activate yourself. And because of that passivity, because of the fact that you can't really make it work right away outside of cards like Reincarnate perhaps, Latian could be issue in normal standard format Hearthstone. Now, that said, in Wild, there are obviously a lot more crazy combinations for this guy that could do some cool things, and cards like Reincarnate are scary. But ultimately, I think because it takes a while to snowball and add up for that real value, a card like Latian would still feel balanced, and also just a good way to capture the card, like shooting electricity out. Overloading to me kind of feels like overcharging yourself. So Latian, being the Thunder King, all about electric lightning bolts and stuff, is a great obvious fit for Shaman as far as the raid boss is concerned, and just a cool design space as well for Shaman. Maybe the crowning piece for the first good overload deck. That's something I personally would like to see. Make use of that core base Shaman mechanic in an exciting new way. Okay, guys. I know, it's another Warlock Legendary. Forgive me, a lot of cool raid bosses fit Warlocks well. Blame the community too. Blame Murgler in this particular instance. This is a 6 mana 3/8 version of Kil'jaeden. And this time around, and also tricky, deceitful sort of effect. This one reads, enemy minions can only attack targets in front of them. And that's really cool, I think. We've seen this before a little bit with the chess style mechanic from One Night in Karazhan with the adventure mode there. It's popped up in things like the Witchwood Monster Hunt as well, with Darius Crowley as the hero, where you have to line up things in a specific way. And I wouldn't hate seeing that actually make its way into Hearthstone, because I like cards that reinforce skill and require you to think a little more, and just the more strategy and depth the game has, I think the better it is for good players to influence the game and have positive outcomes, which ultimately, if you have control, that feels good. And Kil'jaeden's the sort of card that requires you to think and requires you to carefully plan and strategize in a way beyond even normal positioning cards, right? There's other positioning-based cards out there, the Meteors and the Crushing Walls of the world. This takes it to another level because the minion positioning is always kind of changing and moving and updating, and that's really, really cool. Now, I will say that the only downside for this card for me is that this effect only happens when Kil'jaeden's on board. I almost wish it kind of said, like, for the rest of the game, minions can only attack targets in front of them. That might take it even farther. Maybe it'd have to be a little higher cost or have lower stats. I don't know. Because, this is a symmetrical effect at the end of the day. the Warlock player who's playing Kil'jaeden also has to abide by these new rules, and that could be an issue. Now, that said, I think the sort of deck that would run this would clearly have fewer minions and be more focused on spells or removal, probably, because they're not worrying quite as much. But if you wanted to punish your opponent, you do still need to have some minions on the board, or this effect won't do anything in the first place. But I really do like the idea, if your opponent has 2 minions playing Kil'jaeden, can they attack Kil'jaeden? He's not technically in front of them. He's off to the side. So I don't know. But beyond that, adding 4 or 5 minions to the board, hiding a taunt on the end, there are a lot of minions that might not be able to attack at all because only the minion right in front of the taunt could actually attack. So there's some sneaky ways to shut down your opponent's trading. And I'm not going to pretend I understand mechanically how all of this would exactly function. That's not my job. I honestly don't care. We're going to have this discussion a millionth time where I'm more, interested in the idea here. I'm letting Blizzard and their final design team, if they were to ever make this card, they can sort that out and figure out all the mechanics. I'll let you guys in the comments do that too. How do you think this would work? Really, the nitty gritty details there don't change the fun of the design to me. I think there's still a lot of interesting aspects here to think about and talk about. So I like this take on Kil'jaeden. It's a neat idea, and one I'd certainly like to see in Hearthstone. I don't know if it's perfect for a Warlock legendary necessarily. It almost feels like it could be in Rogue or some other class, but still a good idea to capture here, and it's fine in my book for Warlock with Kil'jaeden. So a good card from Murgulmer. Now let's talk about Kael'thas Sunstrider, and I really love this card. 7 mana, 5/5, neutral legendary from Skang, and it reads Battlecry. Discover one of Kael'thas' legendary weapons and equip it. And if you don't know the Kael'thas Sunstrider fight from the Burning Crusade in World of Warcraft, essentially it was really, really hard, but the fight would enable you to pick up these legendary weapons that would help you fight Kael'thas. And this card captures that perfectly because there are 7 legendary weapons here to choose from. Anytime you played Kael'thas, you would get 3 of them randomly to pick from, and you'd have to take your choice. So I don't know if we're going to go through all of these in great detail, but they all do a little bit of different things. So Infinity Blade has Wind Fury. It's a 1/6. And if you kill a minion with it, it gains +1 attack. So it's this blade that sort of spins up over time that's pretty good at dealing with minions. As long as you can get it started, it can become a really powerful removal tool. There's the Staff of Disintegration. After your hero attacks, cast a random mage spell, targets chosen randomly. So it's a bit like a rune spear, but with a lower attack value. Devastation is just a big pile of stats. The Netherstrand Longbow says also damages the minions next to whomever your hero attacks. So we got that effect there. None of these are revolutionary in their own right, but it's just that, first off, all the artwork is there, all the names are good, it all fits the fight perfectly, but just the idea of the choice is what makes it really cool. Warp Slicer with Poisonous, Phase Shift Bulwark. Whenever an enemy attacks your hero, gain 4 armor and lose 1 durability. So you've got this super defensive card and a new idea there. And then the Cosmic Infuser. After you summon a minion, restore health to your hero equal to its cost and lose 1 durability. So another defensively minded one with a new mechanic, but in a different direction that's based on having big minions in your deck. So you can quickly see, depending on what kind of deck you play Kael'thas in and what kind of cards perhaps you have in hand or have left in your draw, the choice you make is really impactful. You might want Phase Shift Bulwark if your opponent has a bunch of small minions on board. You might want the Cosmic Infuser if you have a bunch of big stuff yourself. If they have big stuff, maybe it's the Warp Slicer that makes sense, Even within, a specific scenario, a card like Netherstrand Longbow and Phase Shift Bulwark could both be good. Which one do you choose if they have a small, wide board? Maybe the Longbow's right. If they have 2 health minions, maybe it's not good enough if they have 3 health minions. So I like that this adds so many layers to your decision making. It's not ever controllable, and none of these seem incredibly overpowered. They're often great. Something like Staff of Disintegration seems like it might be the strongest because that's almost an 8 mana card in Hearthstone now. And Kael'thas himself, only 7 mana. So there are still some high rolls within this, but ultimately different directions to go, no consistency, and that's what makes it fair and still feel pretty balanced to me. It's like you're not going to get Staff of Disintegration all the time, and there might be matchups where that's not very helpful, or even classes where that's not very helpful, because Kael'thas is, of course, a neutral. But I could see this played in aggro decks as like a top-end finisher. I could see it in control decks for value or removal, and that's what I like about it. It's one of those universal style cards, almost like the Lich King or something, that we've seen, or Ragnaros maybe, or Sylvanas in the past, where it's just fit into a lot of different decks and different archetypes. And for a character like Kael'thas, who I think is one of the most iconic Warcraft characters and really one of the most iconic raid bosses as well, that's exactly what I'd like to see. So I think this card captures that perfectly. Let's move on to Prime Consort Sinestra, a neutral legendary dragon from Butterscotch, a 7 mana, 6/6 dragon, has Taunt, which is awfully nice, and a battle cry that reads summon 2/0/3 dragon eggs, and one of those eggs is the egg of Onyxia, and one of those eggs is the egg of Nefarian. And you guys might know those names from Hearthstone so far, both cards we've seen in the past, both members of the Black Dragon Flight, and both connect very directly to Sinestra. So a lot of cool lore connections with this card, which I like a ton, and also a pretty realistic and fun nonetheless design for Hearthstone in my mind. And well, I say that because not every card I pick necessarily looks like something that the Hearthstone design team might actually put in the game, but I could absolutely see this being put into the game. This feels incredibly realistic to me. And even though Nefarian is in a wild format, we've even seen that nowadays with cards like Toki, where older cards can be moved into standard format. So I don't even think that's a problem. But if you look at Sinestra, right, it's not the best play necessarily as a 7 mana 6/6. It's a little bit slow. It does have Taunt, which is nice, but clearly you could still get more for 7 mana these days in Hearthstone. The 0/3 eggs themselves also don't do a lot. They're not making an immediate impact. Other than just being some bodies if you have ways to work with bodies. And then even beyond that, once they die, their death rattles, it's not like it's summoning Onyxia or Nefarian, it's adding those cards to your hand. So it's more of a value play than a tempo play. So a fairly slow card, but one that can create very consistent high-end value. And we've seen a card that looks very similar, right, which is Sindragosa for Mage. She summons 2 0/1s, and those eggs, when they pop, give you random legendaries. For Sinestra, this would give you 2 targeted legendaries. And for that reason, I think it does make Prime Consort Sinestra considerably better than a card like Sindragosa. The Taunt makes it more immediately impactful, and the consistency of the eggs also means that the value is guaranteed as opposed to questionable, because sometimes random legendaries can be pretty darn bad. The challenge, though, for this card is the eggs are a little bit harder to kill. Mage is very good at pinging 0/1s and getting that value return quickly. The eggs could be more difficult. They might tend to linger around for a little bit. Beyond that, you may not always find scenarios where something like Onyxia is a great card, but it's kind of almost free. Nefarian also often a little slow, but still kind of free, and you get even more value returned from Nefarian, where he gives you 2 spells from your opponent's class. So all around, a big chain of dragons here. Playing 1 card results in a lot of value, which I think there are certain decks, certainly, and environments and archetypes and metas where this would feel very good, others where it might not feel all that strong. But a card that's very fitting for the character, I think would be cool to bring back to life some dragons we might miss from old or might not otherwise see much. In the case of Onyxia, a card I'd love to see more of in Hearthstone, but we don't. So all around, to me, a neat design, explores a cool boss, and would be good for the game. So now let's talk about General Vezh Axe here from Featherstorm. 5 mana, 2/6 Taunt for Shaman. And the battle cry reads, for the rest of the game, all minions have Overload 1. So a bit like our Kil'jaeden card we talked about previously, this one would affect all minions for the rest of the game that are played. They'd each overload the character playing them by 1. That means yours and your opponent's. So a card here that creates some really interesting disruption opportunities. I think in particular, this does some cool stuff against aggro decks. So if you played this on turn 5, first off, you've got a nice little defensive taunt body. Maybe not the best stat line for 5 mana, but nonetheless disruptive, and it gets in the way and slows them down. And then it also creates this situation where if they play a lot of low cost stuff, if they play 3 or 4 1-mana minions, the next turn, they're going to be overloading themselves very significantly for the turn after. So there's always this sort of delayed overload or punish anytime they like to play a lot of minions. Alternatively, if a deck plays, one big minion, the overload's not going to stack up or add up as significantly. So you create scenarios where this is good against specific kinds of decks. Like a Zoo Warlock might find this card an absolute nightmare, whereas a mid-range deck playing one or two big things at a time might not have as many problems with General Vezh Axe. And then on the other side, of course, you as the shaman yourself are also dealing with the repercussions of this. Maybe you're able to spin that positively into overload synergy cards, or maybe you just find yourself in awkward position sometimes because you wanted to slow down your opponent, but you also penalize yourself a little bit. It's creating friction and, slow down and frustration probably a little bit for both players, but it's doing so in a fun way where you're adding this all this extra planning and thoughtfulness into every single turn. It's making maybe players who normally just play out super fast aggro decks, they got to stop and think about it and line up their turns in sensible and smart ways. And maybe they just get shut out by a card like General Vezh Axe. But maybe that's okay too sometimes, right? It's like, well, it's turn 5. Maybe it would feel a little bit better at turn 6 or turn 7 as far as balance was concerned or counterability was concerned, but it's a card that's a one of in your deck. You're not always going to get it against aggro decks, so there's not a huge degree of consistency here. But I think it creates some fun moments for both sides personally. I don't mind having my plan a little shaken up as long as I have to think about my turns, change my lines of play, figure out how to beat a card like this. That can also be really exciting, and certain decks may not even care at all too, right? This could be a dead card in lots of matchups that just don't play that many minions. If they're more of a spell-oriented deck, yeah, they don't care. You kind of just ran a bad 5-mana card that might have punished you more than really helped your game plan. So metas can shift and move around impactful cards like these as well. But beyond that, I think it's neat in an Overload Synergy deck potentially as well. Now, I can't imagine this card maybe upsetting some people or thinking it wouldn't be good for the game. I guess I just disagree. This is one that I'd like to see. And there you go, guys. That was it for part 8 of my custom card review. Now, a couple things to note before we go. First off, if you'd like to participate in the 9th custom card review, the theme this time around is going to be Rastakhan's Rumble. So design any card you think might fit into the new expansion. Now that means it can be an overkill card, it could be a spirit, it could be a Loa. Even if it's one we've already seen, that's fine. If you have a different take on Bwansamdi, for instance, that's okay. Troll Champion, it could just be a troll or a dinosaur or something related to arena fighting. It does not have to capture a certain mechanic. It just has to fit within the theme of the next expansion in one way or another, but pretty much open book otherwise. Just make sure the name and the artwork and maybe the effect match Rastakhan's Rumble. And of course, as always, you can find the links in the description below to submit your card or multiple cards. If you're a Twitch subscriber, you can always submit up to 5 cards. Normal folks submit only 1, but the details in the description below, just go check that out. All the details, all the links are there. Now, beyond that, we've also got another 4 custom card reviews completed, guys. We've completed 4 more, which means we're going to do another community vote on your favorite cards. I've picked my 10 favorite cards from the last 4 reviews, and I've put them into a poll, and you guys can go vote on your favorite from those 10. And the card that gets the most votes, that person will win a $20 Blizzard gift card, the person who created that card. So if you are up for a vote, yeah, you can go get your friends to vote. That's okay. I can't stop that. But I'll put that in the description as well, a link to the cards and the vote for the giveaway portion, which we'll again do after 4 more reviews when we get to number 12. But good luck to all those folks, and thanks as always for submitting some awesome cards. It's going to be tough to pick your favorite from that set. Now, all that said, of course, if you have thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, any observations you'd like to share, you can leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.